cast your mind back to a simpler time. A time before the polite, robotic voice of a GPS told you to make a U-turn when possible. A time when the only navigation system you had was a frantic shouting match between your parents and a battered, coffee-stained AA Road Atlas that was too big to fully open inside the car. If you grew up in the 70s or 80s, you know this scene well. You're stuck in the back seat of a Ford Cortina or a Austin Allegro, the windows are steamed up, the vinyl seats are sticking to your legs, and there is a thick atmosphere of boredom that only a 4-hour drive to the coast could generate. To pass the time, you pull that heavy book of maps out of the seat pocket. You aren't looking for the route, that was Dad's problem. You are looking for something far more important. You are scanning the tiny text, looking for the holy grail of British geography. And then you find it, printed right there in serious, official cartographic ink. Scratchy Bottom. You nudge your brother, you point at it, you both try to stifle a laugh, because if you wake up Dad, the car turns around. But it's there, a place called Scratchy Bottom. Suddenly, the holiday doesn't seem so boring anymore. Welcome to the great British map of embarrassment. We're a nation obsessed with propriety, manners, and keeping a stiff upper lip, yet for some reason, we live on an island littered with villages named Shitterton, Crapstone, and Great Snoring. To the outsider, it looks like a practical joke gone wrong, but to us, it is history. It is a glorious, eccentric heritage that refuses to be gentrified. Today, we are going to fire up the old engine, roll down the windows, and take a tour of the places you wouldn't dare read aloud in front of your grandmother. This isn't just about rude words, it's about the Vikings who named them, the residents who fight to keep them, and the generations of schoolboys who have giggled at them. So, buckle up. We are going to Bell End. Let's be honest, the specific agony of the British geography lesson was a universal experience for our generation. The classroom was an absolute silence and strict discipline. You had a teacher who likely survived the war and had zero tolerance for nonsense. But then the map would come down, and there it was. The conflict between the innocence of the English language and the filth of the teenage mind. You see, 1,000 years ago, when the Saxons and the Vikings were carving up the land, they were practical people. They didn't speak in double entendres. When they saw a valley, they called it a bottom. When they saw a hill or a mound, they might use the old word cock. To them, a cock-up was simply a small secluded valley where you might hide some sheep. It was innocent, it was descriptive.
Fast forward to 1982, try explaining the nuances of Old Norse etymology to a classroom of 14-year-olds when the teacher points to a village called Tittyho. It was an impossible test of character. You had to bite your lip, look at your shoes, and pray you didn't make eye contact with your best mate, because if you laughed, you were in detention. But how could you not? The map of Britain was essentially a minefield of giggles waiting to explode. Take the village of Sandby Balls in the New Forest, a lovely holiday destination, I'm sure. The name apparently dates back to the reign of Henry VIII and refers to the sandy, dome-shaped outcrops of gravel, a perfectly geological explanation. But try telling that to a car full of teenagers passing the signpost on a bank holiday Monday. It is comedy gold provided by the landscape itself. And that is the beauty of it. These names have survived centuries of change. The Victorians, who were famous for covering up table legs because they looked too provocative, somehow let these names slide. They tried, of course. Maps from the 19th century often tried to euphemize Tittyho to Tee-ho, assuming that would solve the problem. But the locals knew. The locals always knew. And that brings us to the village that perhaps suffers the most, yet stands the proudest. a place that sounds like a distinct medical problem. Wetwang. Wetwang, it sounds like a slapstick sound effect, doesn't it? But to the Vikings, Vetchvanga meant field for legal trials. It was a place of justice, a place of serious debate. Today, it's mostly known for a truly excellent fish and chip shop and the fact that comedian Richard Herring once ran for Parliament there just so he could become the member for Wetwang. He got 9 votes. But honestly, the fact that the village exists at all is a testament to the Yorkshire spirit. They know what you're thinking when you drive past the sign, and they simply don't care. Then there is Bell End. Now, if you grew up watching the Carry On films or laughing at Benny Hill chasing people around a park, you don't need me to explain why this one is funny. But, historically, it just meant a settlement at the end of a bell-shaped hill. Innocent. Practical. Yet I wonder how many teenagers in the West Midlands have stolen that sign for their bedroom wall. The local council probably spends more on replacing signs than they do on road repairs. But not all names are rude. Some are just incredibly, beautifully miserable.
If there is one thing we British do better than anyone else, it is self-deprecation. We turn grumbling into an art form, and nowhere is this clearer than on our map. Imagine it's a wet Tuesday in November. The sky is the colour of old porridge. You miss the bus. You look up at the village sign, and it says, "Pity me." You couldn't make it up. Pity me in Durham. Historians will try to tell you it comes from a corruption of the Norman French petite mer, meaning small lake. But the locals prefer the legend of the monks carrying the coffin of St. Cuthbert, getting caught in a storm and crying out, "Pity me," to the heavens. To be honest, if you've ever waited for a bus there in the sleet, you know the monks were on to something. It captures a specific frequency of British gloom that feels strangely comforting. And then we travel north to the Highlands to the village of Dull. Yes, Dull. D-U-L-L. It derives from the Gaelic for meadow, but let's be real, it's a marketing masterpiece. They embraced it. They even twinned themselves with the town of Boring in Oregon, and later Bland in Australia. It's the Trinity of Tedium. It reminds me of those Sunday afternoons in the 80s. The shops were closed, the pubs were closed, there were only 3 channels on the TV, and one of them was broadcasting a documentary about pottery. Life was dull. But looking back, there was a peace in that boredom that we've lost in this high-speed world. However, we must be careful not to judge a village by its signpost, because sometimes the most laughable names hide the most heroic stories. Take the hamlet of Nasty in Hertfordshire. Nasty. It sounds like somewhere you'd find a witch in a fairy tale. And indeed, local legend says they had trouble with witches there in the 17th century. But during the Second World War, Nasty was anything but a joke. While the name suggests something unpleasant, this tiny collection of 6 houses became a crucial secret base. A farmhouse there was requisitioned to intercept German radio transmissions. The operators sat in that quiet, nasty little corner of England, listening to the enemy, gathering intelligence that helped turn the tide of the war. They took a name that meant bad and did something incredibly good. And then there is Little Cockup in the Lake District. Now, stop sniggering at the back. I know, it sounds like a mistake, a blunder. I've made a bit of a cock-up, but in the Old Norse it just meant a secluded valley with a heap of stones. But in the 1940s, this wasn't a place for mistakes, it was a training ground for the Norwegian resistance. Brave men trained on these harsh, wind-swept fells, preparing for the Telemark raids to stop the Nazis from developing atomic weapons. They looked at a map that said Little Cockup, and they saw a fortress of freedom. It makes you think, doesn't it? We drive past these places, we point, we laugh, and we drive on. We rarely stop to think about the layers of history beneath the tarmac. But of course, there are some places where the history isn't heroic and the name isn't misunderstood. Sometimes the name is just unfortunate and the locals have to deal with it the hard way.
This brings us to the village that fought back. The village that decided enough was enough. The legendary tale of Shitterton. Shitterton. It sits in the beautiful county of Dorset, a picturesque collection of thatched cottages and rolling green hills. It is, by all accounts, an idyllic place to live, except for the name. For decades, the residents of Shitterton faced a unique problem. It wasn't the smell. The stream there is actually crystal clear. The problem was the road sign. Every time the council put up a nice new sign saying Shitterton, someone would drive past, giggle, and throw it in the boot of their car. It was the ultimate souvenir. The village was vanishing from the map simply because the sign kept disappearing. Now, in any other country, the residents might have held a meeting and voted to change the name. They could have called it Riverview or Sunnyside. But this is Britain. We don't change things just because they are inconvenient. We dig our heels in. We exhibit that specific trait known as bloody-mindedness. So, in 2010, the villagers chipped in. They didn't buy a new metal pole. They bought a block of Purbeck stone weighing 1.5 tons. They hired a stonemason to carve the name Shitterton deep into the rock, and they planted it firmly at the entrance of the village. The message was clear. This is who we are. It might sound rude, but it's ours. And if you want to steal this sign, you're going to need a crane and a very strong suspension. That rock stands there today not just as a signpost, but as a monument to British stubbornness. We would rather spend money carving a rude word into stone than admit defeat. And it's the same spirit you find in the Essex village of Ugly. Yes, Ugly, U-G-L-Y. It actually means Uggers Clearing, named after a Saxon landowner who probably had no idea his name would become an insult 1,000 years later. But do the locals hide? Do they weep? No. The local Women's Institute was proudly known as the Ugly Women's Institute. And when developers threatened to overbuild in the area, the protesters marched with banners that read, "Keep Ugly Beautiful."
You have to admire that. It is a level of wit and resilience that you just don't find on a GPS screen. As we reach the end of our journey, folding away our imaginary map, it's worth asking why we love these places so much. Perhaps it's because they remind us of a time when the world wasn't so polished, so corporate, and so safe. A time when a road trip was an adventure into the unknown, fueled by boiled sweets and the fear of getting lost. These names, Scratchy Bottom, Pity Me, Wet Wang, Shitterton, they are the wrinkles on the face of Britain. They show our age, our history, and our refusal to take ourselves too seriously. They are a reminder that even in a landscape of rolling hills and serious history, there is always room for a bit of a giggle. So, I have a question for you. Cast your mind back. Did you ever send a postcard from a place with a rude name just to shock your parents? Or do you remember sitting in the back of that car in 1978, pointing at a sign and watching your dad turn a shade of crimson? Let me know your stories in the comments below. I read them all, and frankly, I think we could all use a laugh right now. If you enjoyed this trip down memory lane and down the B-roads of Britain, please do like and subscribe to the Nostalgia Brit. We have plenty more stories to tell, and I promise the next one will be slightly more polite. Possibly. Until then, keep the map open and mind how you go. Cheerio.